The paper smelled of dust and sweat when Eli Ransom broke its seal. He had expected nothing more than a name written in hired ink, a servant promised from the East, a girl meant to cook, scrub, and keep quiet in his lonely ranch house. The kind of arrangement men like him, widowed too early, half broken by war and years of cattle drives, took as practical necessity. But the handwriting wasn't a stranger's. It was hers. Clara. The name bent his chest in two. He hadn't seen it in 5 years. Not since the trial. Not since the rope had been tied about her wrists while the town spat words like witch, whore, and betrayer. Not since the day she was carted off under the burning noon sun, eyes wide with terror and defiance both. The letter was written small, cramped, as though each word had been scraped from her bones. They sold me, Eli, to you. I carry a mark I did not earn. They said you would use me as servant. But if you still remember, if you still believe I am not the curse they called me, then I am already home. The fire in the hearth snapped. Outside, the Wyoming night pressed cold against the windows. Eli's rough hands tightened, the page trembling though his fingers were calloused like iron. He could still see her then, hair tangled by wind, rope burns on pale wrists, dust streaked on her face as she had tried to meet his eyes one last time before being dragged away. Eli rose slow, shoulders stiff, heart clawing at his ribs. Somewhere out there, she was writing, bound in shame not her own, branded by the lies of men too small to bear the truth. And she was coming to him, whether as servant, ghost, or wife, he could not yet say. He set the letter down like a weapon. And for the first time in years, he felt something other than survival in his blood, the cold weight of choice. The arrival, snow dusted the ground when the wagon came. The driver, a hunched man with whiskey breath, barely slowed as he pulled into Eli Ransom's yard. He barked something low and cruel, then cracked his whip at the team. The horses surged forward, leaving her behind like freight dropped on the dirt. Clara stood there, skirts muddied, hair tangled beneath a ragged shawl. Her hands clutched a small satchel, too light to hold more than a change of clothes and a scrap of bread. Around her neck hung the mark they'd given her, a wooden tag scorched with a single word burned so deep it cut the grain. Which? Her eyes lifted, finding him at the porch rail. The same eyes he remembered from before the world had turned cruel, wide, amber, carrying both fire and fear. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The wind sang through the cottonwoods, sharp as a blade. "You gonna say something?" she asked finally, voice low and roughened by travel. Eli's throat worked. He wanted to say her name, but the sound stuck. Instead, he opened the door and stepped aside. She walked past him without thanks. Dust trailed her boots, and he smelled road smoke on her skin. Inside, she stopped at the hearth, fingers spreading toward the fire like a child starving for warmth. "They said you bought me," Clara whispered, though the word bought caught in her teeth like splinters. Eli shook his head slow. "Didn't know it was you." "They lied." Her laugh was small, broken at the edges. "They always lie." But the rope still burned into my skin. And this, she tugged the tag from her neck and let it swing. The firelight caught the word, glowing like a brand. For the first time since he'd read the letter, Eli's jaw hardened. He stepped forward, plucked the tag from her neck, and threw it onto the fire. It hissed, cracked, and curled, the shame turning to ash in seconds. Clara flinched as though he'd struck her. "They'll come for me," she said. "You know that, don't you? Town won't leave it lie." Eli stared into the flames, his voice low and gravel-thick. "Then let him come." The town's eyes by morning, the news had spread like wildfire on dry grass. Clara Ransom, though no one dared call her by that name, was back. The condemned woman, the so-called witch, the shame they had cast out 5 years prior, was seen stepping off a wagon and into Eli's house like some ghost come home. The townsfolk of Dry Creek gathered at the mercantile, their voices sharp as nails. "She'll curse our wells again," muttered Mrs. Calloway, clutching her shawl tighter, though her own son had been the one found dead drunk at Clara's door the night before the trial. Law should have seen her swing, another spat. But none of them rode to the Ransom Ranch that day. Fear kept them back, and something else too, the uneasy memory of her silence as they jeered, and the way her eyes had looked not damned, but knowing. When Clara ventured into town with Eli, the whispers grew louder. She held her satchel close, chin tilted down, but not broken. The tag was gone from her neck, though the faint line where the rope had dug into her skin was plain for all to see. A boy no older than 10 pointed, tugging at his mother's hand. "Mama, why she got scars?" The woman hushed him quick, but the question hung heavy in the air. Clara stopped, turned her face just enough to meet the boy's gaze. Her lips parted, then closed again. The boy blinked, unsettled, yet did not look away. It was the first crack. At the blacksmith's, Eli bartered for nails, ignoring the eyes burning holes in his back. Clara stood a step behind, heat from the forge painting her face red, sweat beading at her brow. She felt the weight of the crowd pressing closer, words rising like locusts. "That's her. She shouldn't be here. Eli's a fool." And then, a horse tethered to the post refused to budge as its master tugged at the reins. It stamped, snorted, and threw its head back, as though it too would not carry a rider who spoke against her. The murmurs faltered just for a moment. Clara's eyes flicked to Eli. He met her look, grim and steady. In the silence that followed, the anvil rang loud as a church bell. The threat the first stone came at dusk. It struck the side of Eli's house with a hollow thud, sliding down the boards before landing in the dirt. Clara had been mending a tear in her skirt by lamplight when the sound made her stiffen, needle trembling between her fingers. Eli rose from his chair, jaw tight, and stepped onto the porch. The yard was still but for the dark shapes lingering at the edge of the cottonwoods. He couldn't make out faces, only the pale flash of another stone as it arced through the air. This one landed short, rolling harmlessly across the ground. A voice carried on the wind, sharp and bitter. "Send her out. Ransom. We don't want her poison here." Clara stood in the doorway behind him, clutching the hem of her skirt. She said nothing, but her silence had weight, the same silence that had unsettled the crowd years ago. Eli spat in the dirt. "You cowards got something to say," he growled. "Come out where a man can see your eyes." The shadows shifted, but did not step forward. Instead, another voice hissed, "She's a curse. You'll die with her." Then the darkness swallowed them, boots crunching retreat down the trail. Clara's hand lingered on the doorframe, fingers pale in the lamplight. "They won't stop," she whispered. "You know that." Eli looked at her, really looked at her. The scar at her throat, the hollow in her cheeks, the way her shoulders carried not just the weight of the satchel, but the judgment of town. He thought of the letter, her careful words scraped out like blood from stone. "They can't hurt you here," he said. But his voice was softer than the promise, as though he were trying to convince himself. That night, Clara sat awake by the fire, the glow flickering against her tired face. Eli pretended to sleep in his chair, rifle across his knees. Outside, the wind pressed against the house, dragging whispers through the cracks like the voices of ghosts. By dawn, a crude sign was nailed to the fence post, "Get her out." Eli tore it down with one hand. Clara watched, her expression unreadable. For a moment, he thought she might speak, but instead she reached for the kettle and poured him coffee. The steam rose between them, bitter and thin, a fragile truce against a world sharpening its knives. Past on earth, the church bell rang at noon, though it wasn't Sunday. Its clang carried across Dry Creek, summoning more than prayer. By the time Eli and Clara rode into town for supplies, the street was lined with boots and narrowed eyes. Men leaned against posts, women clutched their children close, and the preacher stood in the middle of it all like a judge without a bench. "Ransom," he called, voice thick with heat. "You brought sin back to our doors. Thought we cast it out years ago." Clara kept her gaze low, but her knuckles whitened around the reins. Eli saw it, the tremor, the way her shoulders pulled inward as though she braced for the rope again. The preacher lifted a folded paper, brittle and yellowed with age. "The record still stands. Witnesses sworn she cursed a babe to fever, spoke foul words over a well till cattle dropped. You'd have us believe this creature walks clean?" A murmur rose from the crowd. Some spat in the dirt. Others only stared, uncertain. Eli's voice cut through, low and steady. I was there that day. I heard no curse. What I saw was men drunk on fear, women too proud to see truth. You buried her alive in shame, 'cause it was easier than looking at your own rot. The preacher's face flushed. You defend a witch? Eli turned then, not to him, but to the crowd. His eyes found a woman clutching her boy, the same boy who'd asked about Clara's scars. Eli lifted his hand, pointing to Clara's neck. You see rope burns? That ain't witchcraft. That's what men's hands do when they'd rather bind than believe. The boy pulled free of his mother's grip and spoke, clear as a church bell. She didn't curse me. She looked at me. The silence that followed was raw. A few men shifted their feet. The preacher's mouth opened, then shut. No stone flew. No hand reached for a rope. But Eli knew the fight was not over. He laid a hand on Clara's arm, gentle despite the tremor in his fingers. We're done here. They turned their horses. Behind them, the bell tolled again, but softer this time, as though even iron carried doubt. Fire on the fence the night they came. It wasn't whispers. It was boots. Eli heard them before the dogs barked. A low thunder of men moving together, carrying hate like torches. By the time he stepped onto the porch with his rifle, half a dozen figures had already gathered at the fence line. Their lanterns swung in the wind, throwing crooked shadows across the yard. At the center of the post, nailed with rusted spikes, hung another sign. Not paper this time. Wood. Heavy. Branded with the same word they'd once hung round Clara's neck. Which. The letters were burned deep, black against the pale pine, as though meant to last longer than flesh. Clara stood in the doorway, her shawl wrapped tight, but her face bare. When she saw it, her breath hitched, and for an instant Eli thought she might fall. Instead, she stepped forward, past the threshold, onto the porch beside him. The men muttered. One spat in the dirt. You keep her here. Ransom. You'll rot with her. Better to hand her over. Let us finish what was started. Eli's rifle hung steady, though his voice came slow, like gravel dragged across stone. You'll not take her. Not while I draw breath. Clara moved past him then. Down the steps. Across the yard. Barefoot now, toes sinking into the cold dirt. She reached the fence post, tore the nailed sign free with both hands. It would split her palms, blood streaking the grain. But she didn't flinch. One of the men cursed. She's touched with the devil. No, Eli said, stepping down after her. His boot struck the torch from a man's hand, sending sparks into the dust. He took the sign from Clara, held it high for all to see. This ain't the devil's mark. This is yours. Your fear. Your cowardice. And with that, he hurled it into the fire pit. Flames licked it greedily, letters curling, black smoke rising like a prayer turned to ash. The men didn't move. The crowd of shadows shifted, uncertain, unsettled. One by one, their torches lowered. None dared throw the first stone. The wind caught Clara's hair, lifting it from her face, and in the firelight she looked less cursed than carved from something unbreakable. Blood still fresh on her hands, but her eyes steady. The silence held. Then the men turned back to the dark, boots fading down the trail. Eli stood beside her, smoke stinging his throat. For the first time, he didn't feel like a man holding ground. He felt like one watching a change beneath his boots. Blood in the dust, the reprieve lasted 2 days. Long enough for the air to grow taut, for Clara to wash the blood from her palms though the sting never left, for Eli to hammer new boards over the broken fence. But in Dry Creek, silence was only the breath before the strike. They came in daylight this time. Not shadows, but men bold enough to show their faces. Ranch hands, merchants, even one deputy whose badge caught the sun like a warning. They rode hard, dust rising behind them, and drew up at Eli's yard with the kind of swagger born of numbers. Clara was hanging laundry when she heard the hooves. She froze, a sheet caught in her hands, sunlight pouring through the fabric like a shroud. Eli stepped out from the barn, wiping sweat from his brow, hand already drifting toward the rifle propped against the wall. Ransom, the deputy called. We warned you. Now you'll listen. Eli's jaw flexed, but before he could answer, the deputy's men swung down and strode toward the house. One grabbed the laundry from Clara's hands, yanking the sheet into the dirt. Another shoved her shoulder, hard enough that she staggered back into the post. Eli's rifle cracked before his mind caught up. The bullet chewed the dust at the man's boots, close enough to make him stumble. "Next one's in flesh," Eli said, voice flat. The deputy sneered. "You'd spill blood for her?" "For that." Clara lifted her head then, hair falling loose across her face. She didn't shout, didn't plead. Only stepped forward, rope scar playing on her neck, voice low but carrying. "If truth is poison, then maybe this town was dying long before I returned." The men shifted uneasily. Some spat, but their eyes betrayed the crack in their certainty. It wasn't the words alone. It was the way she stood, hands empty, shoulders straight, daring them to strike again. The deputy's lips curled. "Enough." He raised his hand, and one of his men swung the butt of a rifle into Clara's side. The thud rang sick through the yard. She folded to her knees, gasping. One hand pressed her ribs. Eli's world narrowed. He didn't remember raising his rifle, only the sound. One sharp report that split the air. The deputy's hat flew from his head as the bullet punched the post inches above his ear. The horses spooked, rearing and pulling at their reins. "Mount up," Eli growled, "or bury yourselves here." The men hesitated, eyes darting from Clara's bent form to Eli's steady rifle. Then, one by one, they pulled back, cursing as they went, dust rising to swallow them once more. Eli dropped to Clara's side, hands rough but careful as he lifted her. Her breath came shallow, but her eyes opened, fierce even in pain. "They'll be back," she whispered. "I know," he said, voice breaking under its own weight. "But so will I." And in that moment, reluctant as it was, the choice was no longer his to skirt. He had bound himself to her survival, as surely as the rope once bound her wrists. The reckoning the town gathered at dusk, lanterns swinging like angry stars. Word had spread. Ransom fired on a deputy's men. Clara spat defiance in the dirt. Now the street outside the church filled with bodies pressed close, mutters sharp as knives. Eli led Clara there himself, not because he trusted them, but because he was finished with shadows gnawing at the edges. She leaned on him, ribs bound tight, her steps measured but steady. Every head turned as they walked into the square, some with rage, some with unease, a few with something quieter, harder to name. The preacher stood on the steps, Bible in one hand, gavel in the other. "You bring shame here again," he thundered. "Blood, blasphemy, rebellion. You protect what should have burned." Eli's voice carried, low but cutting. "What burned was justice. What you nailed to posts, branded into wood, was your own fear. I won't bury her for it." A murmur ran through the crowd, sharp as wind through grass. Some shouted back, but others held still, faces clenched, eyes darting. Clara pulled free of Eli's arm and stepped forward. Her voice was thin from pain, but clear. "5 years ago, you named me witch. Do you remember what my crime was?" Silence. No answer. She turned her head, scanning them. "I tended the sick child of a man too drunk to keep water clean. I buried his fever with prayers, and when the child died, you buried me instead. You feared the truth, that sickness comes not from curses but from your own neglect. That women with voices are easier to burn than sins you carry." The words fell heavy. For a moment, only the hiss of lanterns filled the air. Then a cough, a shuffle, and from the crowd, the same boy's voice as before, thin, unafraid. "She ain't a witch. She's just hurt." His mother tried to hush him, but the sound had already cracked the silence. An elder at the back nodded once, slow. A horse tied nearby stamped, refusing to move as a man tugged at its reins. The smallest of rebellions, but enough to turn breath into tremor. The preacher's hand shook around the gavel. He raised it, then let it fall useless to his side. The crowd didn't surge. They didn't cheer either. They simply stood, fractured, the weight of certainty drained from their eyes. Eli stepped up beside Clara, his hand brushing hers, rough, reluctant, but there. "We're done here," he said again, but this time the words held. They left the square together, not triumphant, but unbroken. Behind them, the church bell rang once flat, without fervor. Like even iron had grown tired of judgment. The quiet proof winter pressed hard on the plains after that night. The snow came early, muting the land in silence, burying tracks of hooves and anger alike. The town of Dry Creek never spoke of Clara's trial again, not out loud, not where ears could hear. But the weight of it hung in every glance, every muttered prayer left unfinished. At the ranch, life pared itself down to simple hours, mending fences, feeding stock, warming hands by the fire. Eli worked with a steadiness that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with endurance. Clara moved slow, ribs still tender, but she carried herself different now, shoulders unbowed, gaze level. On the first thaw, she walked to the edge of the yard where the burned sign had fallen to ash. The ground there was blackened, scarred like her own skin. She knelt, fingers raw against the dirt, and pressed a seed into the soil. Then another. Then another. Eli watched from the porch, arms folded, saying nothing. By spring, a row of green shoots pierced the charred earth. Small, defiant, alive. When the wind blew through them, they whispered louder than any curse, louder than any gavel. Clara touched the scar at her neck one evening as the sun bled red across the hills. "They'll never call me innocent," she said. Eli's voice came from the shadowed doorway, rough as the boards beneath his boots. "Maybe not, but they'll remember you stood." She turned then, eyes catching the last of the light. "And you with me." He didn't answer. He only stepped down, took the watering pail from her hands, and poured it slow over the fragile green. The sky darkened. Coyotes howled on the ridges. Somewhere far off, a bell tolled, faint, uncertain, as though even it had learned doubt. Clara's garden grew in silence, proof carved not in fire or rope, but in stubborn life pressing up through burned soil. And those who passed the ransom place in years to come would whisper of it, not loud, not bold, but around campfires in kitchens on long rides across lonesome country. The tale of the woman condemned, the man reluctant, and the small patch of earth where shame was burned to ash and turned instead to roots. A legend not of triumph, but of survival. And maybe that is the truest victory the West ever allowed.